Okay, welcome back. So here's where we left off last time. We have our game that has a goal screen and a panel that fades in. Goal screen kind of drops down. You click OK, fades away, and the game starts. We have our goals up here in the upper right hand corner. And if we meet one of those goals, then, oops, there we go. Then it will increase the number that we currently have. For example, there we go, we got 1 breakable tile and 3 green tiles. So what we want to do today is we want to create the second half of this kind of n-level system, which is something that's counting down, either counting down by number of moves taken or counting down by time elapsed. And we're going to have that go in the center here because I'm kind of trying to emulate a bit how Candy Crush looks. So we're going to have 2 labels here, one that says moves and one that says time, and we'll turn those active depending on what kind of requirement this particular level has. And then we'll have a counter here that will work for both moves and for time. Then whenever we make a move, we're going to decrement that counter, or if we're in the time version of it, for every second that goes by, we'll decrement the counter. When the counter reaches 0, we'll pop up with an end game screen. And if we reach all of the requirements before the counter reaches 0, then we'll pop up with a game win screen. So let's get to it. First thing I want to do is in the board class, I want to create a new child game object, and I'm going to call this Endgame Manager. So I'm just going to create an empty game object here, and I'll call this Endgame Manager. I'm going to create a script to go with this. Okay, sorry for that weird cut. I'm going to make a new script here, also called Endgame Manager. So C# script, Endgame Manager. And then I will open this up in MonoDevelop. And once that's done, I will meet you back here. Alright, so here's my Endgame Manager script. First thing I want to do is I want to have some little an enumerator, an enum that tells me if I'm using either time or moves to decide the end of the match. So I'm going to make that first. So this is going to be a public enum, and I'll call this game type. And the 2 different game types we're going to have here are moves and time. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little public class that's a little container here that's going to hold not just the type of game it is, but what that counter's initial value should be. So this is going to be a public class, and I'm going to call this, let's say, Endgame Requirements. It's kind of long, but it'll be fine. So in the endgame requirements, I need to know what kind of game it is. So I'm going to require to have a public game type, and I'll call this game type. And then I'm also going to have an integer value for either what the time should be set to or what the move should be set to. So public integer, I'm just going to call this counter value. Okay, cool. Now, I want to reference that little container inside my script here. So in my Endgame Manager, it's checking for updates. There we go. So in my Endgame Manager here, I'm going to reference my Endgame requirements. So I'm going to do public Endgame requirements, and I'll call it just requirements. Okay, all right, 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So we got our endgame requirements, which is just requirements. Now, if I save this, we've kind of gone over this before, but I just want to show one more time. If I go back into Unity here, choose my Endgame Manager object once it's done compiling, and attach my Endgame Manager script to it, you'll see that even though I made that public, it doesn't show up. And the reason it doesn't show up is because this is a custom class. And Unity can't show custom classes in the editor unless they're what's called serialized. So I need to add a little line to this up above as a tag in square brackets, system dot serializable. And now when I save my script and go back into Unity, once it's done compiling, I should be able to see my little custom class there. Oh, yeah, there it is, right there. So I'm going to start with just moves, and I'm going to put my counter value to 40. And I'm just putting it at something just so I can see what its value is. All right, now what I want to do here is I want to add some stuff to my main screen. So I'm going to take my entire fade panel and turn it off for the moment. And I'm going to go to my scene view and just kind of zoom in here onto my UI panel. So on my UI panel, in my top UI, I don't know why my score text is outside of it. I'm going to add my score text to there. Alright, cool, that didn't change anything. Okay, so in my top UI here, I'm going to create a new UI text. I'm going to move this up, make it nice and big, make sure it's in the center. There we go. Now, whenever you create a new UI object, I saw some people asking about this in the comments. The anchors for that UI object by default are in the center, and they're these 4 white triangles. They can be kind of hard to see. If I click away from this text value, I'll see the goal containers anchors, because that's the new active object, and I set those to be exactly where it is on screen. If I look at my score bar, I set those to be kind of here on the left-hand side in the middle. And my score text is set to be up here. Now, I'm going to set my anchors to be exactly where I want this box to be. So I'm just going to grab that upper left triangle here and move it. Or sorry, upper right. I'm going to grab the lower left triangle and move it. Okay. And now with my text here, I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it, how about moves label? So moves label. I'm going to change this text to just say moves. I'm going to center it. My font style I'm going to make bold, and I'll make it white. And I'll also choose best fit to make it nice and big. There we go. Now, I'm going to duplicate this label because I want to keep all the settings. And I'm going to change the text from saying moves to saying time. And I'm going to change its name from moves label to time label. Alright, cool. So now, if the time label is active but the moves label isn't, you see time. And vice versa. If the moves label is active but the time label isn't, you see moves. So we're going to have our script decide which of these to turn active. Then I'm going to create another text element here. So UI text. And that's going to go right here in this little area I've kind of carved out for it. And I'm just going to call this counter. So make sure it's centered. I'm going to move my anchors here and here. Center the text in both directions, and I'm just going to put 2 zeros here as a placeholder value. This value is going to be changed in text. Let's make it white, let's make it bold, and let's make it best fit. Now, you can do a lot to add to the way the game looks by changing these from the Arial font to a different font. There's many places online that you can find commercial use fonts if you wanted to make this a commercial product. Just make sure that you treat fonts the same way you would any other art assets. Don't use a font you don't have permission for. It's just not a good look. Okay, cool. I'm going to change this from saying text to saying counter. Alright, so now we've got our 3 different things here. I'm going to go into my script here. And because I'm going to have to reference some elements of the UI, I'm going to need to make sure to add the UI to my using tags. So up here where it says using, I'm going to add using, Unity engine.ui. Now, for the moves and the time, I'm going to reference those as game objects. So we'll do public game object, and I'll call this moves label, and another one for the time label. Now, people have asked me before why I make sure to do separate entries for every variable, because what I could do if I wanted to here is I don't have to do a separate line. I could just put a comma. Sorry for that weird cut. I have kittens in the house and they are very curious about what I'm doing. Okay, so I don't have to have two separate entries. I could just have this be game object, and then anything that comes after it delineated by commas is a game object. But I like doing it on separate lines like this. I'm not really sure why I do. This is just how I do it. Anyway, so the last one I'm going to reference is text, and that's the counter. So public text counter, and I'm referencing it as text because I want to be able to change the text component. The other two, I'm just turning them on and off, so I don't need to be able to reference them specifically as text. So I'm going to make a little method here. I'm going to call this setup game, how about? So this is going to be void, why does Visual Studio do that? Setup game. Okay. And then in here, I'm going to have this check what the endgame requirements are. If the endgame requirements are moves, then we're going to make moves active and time inactive. If the endgame requirements are time, we'll make moves inactive and time active. So that's the first thing. So let's say if requirements dot game type is double equal to game type dot moves. There's only two options here. It's either moves or time. So I only have to do an if and an else statement. So if it's game type dot moves, then I'm going to do moves label dot set active true, and time label dot set active false, and vice versa. So no, not class, else, and I'll just copy and paste these two lines and switch the true and false values. So copy, paste. This one's going to be false, and this one's going to be true. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to set the counter value. So I'm going to say counter.text is equal to, and this has to be a string. We've talked about this before. So I'm going to do open close quotations so that it becomes a string. And I want to add to it, we need to have something that keeps track of the counter value. So I'm going to make two different integers here. I'm going to make just one. So we're going to say public int, and this is going to be current counter value. And I'm going to set my counter text equal to the current counter value. So there we go. And then I want to make my current counter value equal to this counter value to start. So current counter value is equal to requirements dot counter value. And then, yeah, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to call setup game from my start method. And save that again. I'm going to pop back into Unity here. And find my endgame manager. Okay, cool. And now I've got all these empty spaces. So I'm going to make my moves label where it should be, my time label where it should be, and my counter where it should be. And current counter values down here. So it should say moves 40 when we start this time. And let me turn my fade panel back on because that might get wonky if I don't. So let's hit play. So it comes in, fades out, moves 40. Now let's make sure it works by changing it here. So I'm going to go from moves 40 to time, let's say 100. And if I hit play, we should see time 100 when we start the game. Let's check that. Alright, cool. So that's working like it should be. Now we need to have a way to decrease this. So to do that, in our code for our Endgame Manager, we're going to need a few more methods here. So let's create a method that's called maybe decrease counter value. So void decrease counter value. And I'm going to need to call this from the dot class for when I make a move. So I'm going to make this public. Alright, so public void decrease counter value. What I want to do in here is I want to change the counter value, and then once the counter value is changed, I want to change the text as well. So we're going to say current counter value minus minus, and then what did I call it? Counter? Yeah. That text is equal to open close plus current counter value. So we're decreasing the value, and then we're going to change the text. Now we only want to do this if we have a counter value that's greater than 1. Because if we're going from, actually, greater than 2? No, greater than 1. So if our counter value is greater than 1, otherwise we want to say it's an endgame, because we don't want our counter to go down to like -2, -3, -4. So we'll say if current counter value greater than 1, should be greater than or equal to 1. Greater than or equal to 1. And if it's not greater than or equal to 1, that means it's 0. So we're going to just do a debug statement for today. Debug.log, you lose. That seems aggressive. I should just say try again, but no worries. Okay, cool. So what I want to do now is go to my dot here, and the dot should know what the Endgame Manager is so it can communicate with it. So I'm going to do that really fast. So let me see where I did all my private stuff. Right here with the hint manager. So we'll do private Endgame Manager, call it Endgame Manager, and then finish that reference in the start method where I did hint manager. So Endgame Manager equals find object of type Endgame Manager, and then I should do it in the coroutine where we're checking if the move is valid. So if we make an invalid move, we don't want that to count against their moves. So down here, if other dot isn't null, if this isn't matched and the other dot isn't matched, we don't want to do it in here because this is if it wasn't a valid move. We want to do it down here. So first we want to check to make sure that the Endgame Manager isn't null. So if Endgame Manager isn't null, so if it actually got assigned like it should have been, and then if Endgame Manager dot, did I call it game type? Oh, I call it requirements. Dot requirements dot game type is equal to game type dot moves. So if it's the moves game type here, so first we're checking to make sure that this got assigned, that there was a game manager in the scene. Then we're checking to make sure if it's in the moves type, then we're going to decrease the counter. So in game manager dot decrease counter value. Okay, cool. So this won't be accessed if we're on a time version. To have it count down if we're doing time, we're going to do something in the Endgame Manager here. So I'm going to have a placeholder value in here that I'm going to call a private float. And this private float is going to be, I'll call it timer, I don't know, timer seconds. So what I want to do is in my update method, I want to check what the game type is. So if requirements dot game type is game type dot time. So if we're in the time, no, not moves, time. So if we're in the time game type, then I want to decrease my timer seconds. So I'm going to say timer seconds minus equals time dot, good lord, time dot, no, not timer seconds, seriously, time dot delta time. So I'm checking to see what game type it is. If we're in the, I don't know why I used 3 equals. If we're in the time game type, then we're going to decrease by however much time passed since the last frame. And we're going to say if timer seconds is less than or equal to 0, because it might pass over 0, then I want to decrease counter value. Now, by default, timer seconds is going to be 0. So what I want to do here is in my setup game, I'm going to say, where we're checking to see what game type it is. If it's the time game type, then we're going to say timer seconds is equal to 1. So that it starts counting down, so it doesn't automatically jump down 1 second. Okay, that should be good. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go into Unity here. I'll let that compile. I'm going to turn off my fade panel because I want to be able to see it count down right away. So turning off the fade panel, my Endgame Manager is set to time with a counter value of 100, which means that it should start counting down right away. So let's test this out. Okay, so I forgot one line of code there. So just to show you guys what happened here, just to explain where I went wrong. So it doesn't automatically start counting down. It waited 1 second. But now that it's waited 1 second, it's going to decrease every frame because because I never reset the timer seconds equal to 1. And so timer seconds is less than 0. When it goes through the next frame, it's still less than 0 because I never reset it. And so it's decreasing every frame, which is kind of a neat look, but let's not do that. So in here, I'm going to change decrease counter value underneath it. I'm going to say timer seconds equals 1. There we go. So I'm going to save that, pop back into Unity here, hit play. And okay, and there we go, functioning timer. Now let's test out the other version. Let's make it moves, and I'll just leave it at 100. So let's hit play. And okay, so we got 100 moves. I'm going to make a move that won't make a match here. It doesn't decrement, but I'll make a move that does make a match. And there we go. And it doesn't count all those extra matches. It only counts the actual moves, which seems fair. And if you do something that doesn't make a match, it doesn't count down. All right, so that's the beginnings of creating the end level requirements. Next time, which will be tomorrow, I will show you how to have it not just show a debug. Oh yeah, sorry. Before we get there, I want to make sure that it shows the you lose statement when it should. So I'm going to change this to time. I'm going to change it to 2. I'm going to hit play here really quickly. And as soon as it gets down to 0, we should see a little debug statement telling us that we lost. And there we go. We had a full second after it hit 0, which I think is kind of fair. Now let's try moves. So when this gets brought up, all right, cool. So I'm going to drag that over down to 1 move, and let's do, here we go, 0 moves. So probably should be 2 then. Yeah, you lose. Because you get an extra move at 0. If I made that 2, yeah, let's try that. Oops. Gonna hit play here. So we got our moves counter. Okay, so 1 move left, and now after I make this move, it should tell me I lose. Oh. Why didn't it? Oh, that's why. So let me change the way I do this decrease counter value here. So I'm going to get rid of this if that's starting it out. And I'm going to get rid of the else statement too. So I'm just going to have it decrease the counter value no matter what. And then, oops. And then, rather than checking before it decreases, I'm just going to have it decrease, change the text, and then we're going to say if current counter value is equal to 0, then we're going to do the you lose statement, but we're also going to make sure that the current counter value changes to 0. So yeah, so let's actually do, sorry, I'm scattered. Let's do less than or equal to 0, and then we'll say current counter value equals 0 and counter.text is equal to plus current counter value. Okay, so what I was doing before is I was only decrementing it if it was greater than or equal to 1, which meant that it would only go to 0 if it was at 1, but that caused an issue with the moves, giving them an extra move at 0. So now instead, I'm always going to decrement the counter, but then after I decrement it, I'm going to check to see if it's less than or equal to 0. If it is less than or equal to 0, we're going to tell them that they lost. We're going to reset the counter value to 0 and reset the counter text to current counter value. And then the other thing that I want to do here is in the requirements.gametype equal to gametype.time, I don't want to keep counting down because we're using up just a tiny bit of power, but we're using some system resources there. So I'm only going to count down if it's gametype.time and if the current counter value is greater than 0. Yeah, current counter value greater than 0. So if it's equal to 0, then we won't decrement. All right, so back into Unity here, hit play. Let that compile for a second. Okay, so 2 moves, 1 move, 0 moves, you lose. All right, cool. Let's try it out with time. So it starts out with 2 seconds. 1 second, 0, you lose. All right, cool. That's better. All right, so today we started by creating these end level conditions, and both the win and the lose statements just lead to debug, which is fine for now, but we'll fix that next time. What my plan essentially is to do is in this fade panel here, we have we have one panel right now. We have this one that pops in at the beginning. I'm going to make a duplicate of this just to kind of follow this idea, and I'm going to have one of them be try again, and then an OK button, and the other one be you win, and then an OK button, so that we can have these lead to some sort of scene selection or level select screen. And then once we have that working, then we can work on the level select so that we can have something that isn't quite like Candy Crush the way we're going to do it, but relatively similar. And then we can also talk about making multiple board types. So that's what you have to look forward to. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments down below. You can follow me on Twitter to find out when I post a new video. You can join the Discord, where I'm chatting pretty much every day. And yeah, I hope you have yourself a wonderful day.